So here we are, our good old CIA map of the Golan Heights. It's actually one of the better maps. It does say Israeli occupied. I always, whenever I see occupied, I think of a bathroom in an airplane. It's like, occupied. I never really thought of it as a political word, but, I don't want to go there. It's a thing. But anyway, we're using the Golan Heights for now. Israeli occupied. But anyway, it's an excellent map, actually, I think. And again, it shows the tri-state border on top, Lebanon on the left, Syria on the right, and Israel down the middle. It's shaped like a crescent moon at the bottom. Another tri-state border, Syria on the right, Jordan underneath, and above is Israel, Golan Heights. And the arrow is pointing right at the village that we don't know the name of. We do not know the name of. It's had, in the past few years, in the past 20 years, it's had 3 different names, and we still don't know the name of the place. Hopefully one day we'll find out, but until now it's guesswork. And the ancient Arabic word, which is also fascinating. So it's very close to Gamla. It's in the southern Golan Heights. You can see there's all these Jewish villages around them. There's many synagogues here. Just to remind everybody, the greater we have found in Israel about 120 synagogues, and 30 at the moment are in the Golan Heights and counting, which means a quarter of all the ancient synagogues are in the Golan Heights. That doesn't mean that there were a quarter of the Jews here, not at all. It just means that because this was off the grid and armies weren't coming to and fro in ancient times, all the other synagogues, most of the other synagogues were destroyed. In the Golan Heights, it was like nobody really cared about it. So things were left intact. And that, of course, is a dream for archaeologists. So who's the first person who ever said that there's a Jewish village in the Golan Heights? The truth is, the man who wrote about it for the first time was an interesting chap. This is him. He looks kind of like, a Rebbe without a kippah, but Seder, It was actually a Scottish man who was born in South Africa, but he was a member of British Parliament. His name was Lawrence Oliphant, and his parents already were Christian Zionists, one of the first. And he also considered himself a Christian Zionist. He was so pro-Jewish people and Israel, much more than many of the Jewish people. So he would do everything he could. He thought that the Jewish people should get out of Russia, get out of Europe. It's too dangerous. They should go to the homeland, not because he wanted to get rid of them. He thought they should go back to the homeland. Indigenous people should go back to their land because they're suffering out here, especially in Russia. And therefore, he did everything he could to help. He got money from all kinds of various sources to help Jewish farmers. And many people who were pioneers back in 120 and 100 years ago would have 3 pictures in their home. They'd have a picture of Baron Rothschild, who was the big tzedakah giver for the farming communities, Baron Hirsch, who also did a lot, and Lawrence Oliphant. He was like one of the big 3. And for instance, one of the things that bothered him was that Jewish people would move to Israel, but they'd stay around the coastline. He said, no, go up to the mountains. That's where the Jewish people used to be. And people wanted to stay in the port. Like he was an amazing person. He was a mystic. He was a little eccentric. He was a world traveler and an explorer and adventurous. And he discovered all kinds of interesting things. And one of the things he did, he went to the Golan Heights and he discovered synagogues. How did this man he wasn't an archaeologist, he wasn't Jewish, how can he identify synagogues? He found like 5 of them. And so he gets on a horse and he pays money to an Arab guide, a Bedouin, to take him up to the Golan Heights. And he hears from the Arab guide that there's a place called the Ruins of the Jews. Now this is fascinating because as we know, many of the Arab people who were living in the land of Israel when we were gone, as it were, from the exile to the time we started coming back, kind of about 120 years ago, the Arab people kept the names that were of the Jewish villages. And if they didn't know the name, they'd call it the ruins of the Jews. So they didn't know the name of this village. They called it the ruins of the Jews. So he gets very excited because he thinks, of course, there's going to be a synagogue there. And he goes to this place in the Golan Heights, and he asks him, what's its name? And he says, we call it El Kanatir, which means the mother of all arches. And the book that he wrote, which is called Haifa, Haifa, or Life in Modern Palestine, is a fascinating book. And the Arab man brings him to this big public building that's facing north, directly towards Jerusalem. And he writes the following. This is a man who's discovered things all over the world, Japan and the Caribbean, all over the world. And he writes the following. Altogether, I regard these ruins of El Kanatir as the most interesting discovery I have yet made. And this was in 1886. Incredible. He gave us this gift. And he had a friend. And his friend is the following man, Gottlieb Schumacher. As you can imagine, he was of German ancestry. And he was actually born, believe it or not, in Zanesville, Ohio. What is a Gottlieb Schumacher doing in Zanesville, Ohio? Well, his parents came from Germany, left Germany and came to the United States. And then they joined a group of German Protestants who mainly came from Germany, but a few from the United States, who moved to the Holy Land in order to live exemplary lives and bring the Messiah. The very special group called the Templars, using, with a different spelling, the name of the Crusader orders of the Templars, and they were great builders, and they built the German colony in Tel Aviv called Sarona, and they built the German colony in Jerusalem called the German colony, and they built the German colony in Haifa, right underneath the Baha'i Gardens. And today, his house is a hotel, a really nice one. The last clients I had before Corona stayed in the Schumacher, and it's a new hotel, a little boutique one, beautiful house. And he was an engineer, and he was sent to Germany to learn engineering, and then he moved with his parents to Haifa, and he was part of this big project in the 1880s, also 1886. The Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was on its way down, and they called it the old sick man on the Bosphorus. And it's only a matter of time until someone else is going to take over. Indeed, 30 years later, World War I, and Britain took over, but and Germany and Turkey fought together. But before that, when they were trying to show their prowess, they decided that what they were going to do is make a railroad from Haifa all the way to Mecca. Now, there already was from Syria to Mecca. So now they had to make a railroad that would go to Haifa and go to a city in Syria. And they couldn't plan it themselves, so they brought in German engineers, the best in the world at the time. And Gottlieb Schumacher was the man who was to do the survey and to give his opinion where it should be. And while he was making the survey, he made this beautiful map, wrote a whole book, a map that's still used today, an incredible map with the names of the villages, and he talked about how do you pronounce your village, and it was a fascinating book called The Golan. And he decided that it would go by this area, and that's where he, along with Oliphant, walked around and decided, yes, this is an ancient synagogue, which we'll soon see, in an ancient village. And they decided it was probably around from the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. It turned out that wasn't true, but the fact that they weren't archaeologists in the classic way, and the fact that they could do that, they were off by a couple of hundred years, but how would we, if we were how would we be able to even to judge that? By the way, Schumacher was one of the diggers at Megiddo. Even though he wasn't an archaeologist, you didn't have to be an archaeologist back then to dig at Megiddo. The modern archaeologists say he did a lot of damage, but compared to the other archaeologists, they said it did relatively little damage. And he found some interesting things at Megiddo. So an engineer could do that. One thing, he was very, very orderly, as Germans are, very, very orderly. And we'll see how the German way of doing things actually affected our village called El Kanatir. So these two men, not Jewish, loved synagogues and loved finding them. Incredible, incredible folks. This is pretty much what they saw, a pile of stones. And if you look carefully, you can see that there's still the foundations of some walls. And I remember I used to bring groups here. They weren't very happy to get here, but we're going to go see an ancient synagogue. Okay, this is an ancient synagogue. Well, thanks a lot. I mean, it's cool, but you can just see that there's this huge public building and it's facing Jerusalem. It's beautiful scenery. Even here in the summer, you can see the Kinneret over here. This is Tiberias, Mount Tabor in the background. And that was it. In 1886, these guys found it and they wrote about it. They wrote about it in the publication of the PEF, the Palestine Exploration Fund, which was run by Great Britain. So they brought it out and people knew about it. Another thing that they found was a house that was lived in a few months of the year by some Bedouin. This is, by the way, a picture taken in 1967, right after the Six-Day War, when one of the first things they did in the Golan is send a group of archaeologists to check out what do we have in the Golan. And they found here the wooden door you can see here. And here you can see some capitals that went on top of pillars. And here's a beautiful capital that has a vulture on it and another really beautiful capital above it. And you can't blame the guy. He's sitting here. There's ruins that have been here for thousands of years. Nobody's coming back. I'm building a house. I want it to be nice. I'll schlep. It's just a few square meters away from the synagogue. I'll schlep the stone over and I'll make a nice house out of it. After 1967, when they saw this, I remember seeing this in the beginning. And then at some point, they knocked the house down in order to take this stone and bring it to the museum in Katsrin because they were afraid that maybe somebody would just come and take it. And then the house fell down, but nobody had been living in it since before, like in the 50s. The Bedouin would still come here. And afterwards, it was a closed military zone. Syria wouldn't let people come. Now, of course, me being from the border of Kansas and Missouri, this is the first thing I think of when I think of El Kanatir, because El Kanatir, which was the name that the Arab man told them, is the place of the arches. The place of the arches. When I hear arch, I immediately remember as a little kid, I grew up on the Missouri. This is on the Mississippi. We drive all the way to St. Louis. And I remember it being built and being on top of it. And wow, it was a thing, the gateway to the West. Clark, who's the guy with Clark? Not Lawrence and Clark. Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark started their expedition to the Pacific from St. Louis. This was like, once you get past St. Louis, you're in Nowheresville. That's Kansas, really. You're in the Wild West. And an arch means something. It's a gateway. There are more arches in El Kanatir than anywhere in Israel. And it was a motif that they loved there. So it's just a thing that I immediately think of St. Louis. But these are the arches that Gottlieb Schumacher saw and drew. Yes, Stephanie, you're right. I didn't think about the golden arches. I suppose that if I had grown up in the United States a little later, I would put a picture of McDonald's there. But I missed the McDonald's generation, luckily, I think. But yeah, so these are the golden arches. They're the black arches. They're basalt that Gottlieb Schumacher drew in 1886. And these can still be seen today. This is a picture taken in 1905. And this is only 20 years after it was first discovered. And this was another group of German, this time architects that came, a pair. They're known as Kohl, K-O-H-L, and Watzinger. Kohl and Watzinger were German architects who loved synagogues. Go figure. all these German guys are coming to Israel and discovering our ancient synagogues. I think it's incredible. I wish the German people would have continued on that path, but I mean, they came here and they already had cameras. They went all over the Galilee, they found synagogues, and they loved measuring them. They just liked measuring them, and they drew up the plan. They drew up the plan of the synagogue, and they also drew up the plan of these arches, which apparently gave the name of the Arabs who lived at the time. The Bedouin called it the place of the arches, and there's these huge monumental arches. If we go back, you can see that Schumacher draws two big trees in front of them, and here, 20 years later, there's still a big tree, looks like an oak from here, that's there. And later, after 67, that tree wasn't there anymore. But these folks who came measured the synagogue. We'll see how that affected how we understand Umul-Kanatir when we get a little bit later to the actual plan. And this was the keystone on top of that arch, which until about 6 years ago was just, you'd stand there underneath and you're like, just one little tremor. And once this keystone falls down, the whole arch is going to come down. And my neighbor, the archaeologist, went to the Antiquities Authority and said, guys, we need to fix this arch because that thing is going to fall and the whole arch is going to come down and then we're going to have to rebuild it and it's going to be much more expensive. And they said, look, we don't have enough money right now, maybe later. And then about 6 years ago, there was a huge storm and a boulder came down and hit, and the whole arch came tumbling down. It had lasted for approximately 1,700 years. And then this stone fell down and the whole thing fell down. But luckily, they built it right back up and they knew exactly where each stone was. So this is something actually that Schumacher and Oliphant already saw in the 19th century. It's been hanging like that for a while. And then something happened. People started thinking out of the box because it was an ancient synagogue. So it was an ancient synagogue. Until this guy on the left wearing a white shirt, whose name is Yehoshua Drey. Okay, this man, I don't think he has a college degree. He didn't study archaeology. Every archaeologist in the country consults with him because he understands things that other people don't. Now, here, what you're seeing now is a contest that he had with an archaeologist on how exactly people used to make wine out of stomping on grapes. And a very famous archaeologist said, this is the way they did it. And Yeshua said, so Yoshua, his nickname, because he used to have long red hair and walk around barefoot with a robe, his nickname was Jesus, which in Hebrew is Yeshu. He's not a born-again Christian or anything. He's a nice Jewish boy, but his nickname is Yeshu. It's a thing. So Yeshu said, okay, you know what? I challenge you to an actual stomping competition. We're going to make wine with Carmel Mizrahi people, you know, the big winery, and then we'll taste it. We'll taste your grapes, your wine, and we'll taste my wine. And he won, okay? So everybody consults with this man. And he came and met an archaeologist who lives in the Golan. His name is Chaim Ben David, and who's like the archaeologist with the Golan. And these two guys together decided to do something no one had ever done before. It's so full of chutzpah and ridiculous. It's like it should be in the startup nation. They decided for the first time to take all those rocks and rebuild the synagogue. It had never been done before. One of the pluses was that they knew that the synagogue had been destroyed in an earthquake and not by some war where people tried to destroy things, but rather it fell over in an earthquake, and that would actually be of great help. Plus, these guys believed in it, and nobody else, people laughed at them in the beginning. You can't build a synagogue, and even if you did, who's going to insure it? Like, what if it falls down? There'll be another tremor. You're going to be that sure to do it because it was built with no cement. It was built in dry building. You're obviously going to build it in dry building. So how are you going to, who's going to insure it? And they said, we can do it, and you'll see, it'll work. And they did it. And this, in general, is the story of pretty much how they did it. Now, this man, just to understand how he thinks out of the box, this is a picture of an ancient 3,000-year-old grape vat that was found in northern Israel, and they were making a big road, Highway 6, and it's going to go right next to this grape vat. And the Ministry of, and the Antiquities Authority said, look, this is an ancient thing, you can't destroy it. So they brought in Yeshu, and Yeshu said, okay, we won't destroy it, we'll just move it. How can you move it? We brought in these gigantic saws, and he simply cut this grape vat out of the stone, lifted it up with a crane, and took it to a park where they have archaeological things. By the way, he did the same thing with the mikvah in Modi'in, where they were going to build a big building. They were like, you can't move a mikvah. He said, sure I can. He brought in this gigantic saw. They moved it. They brought in a crane, 2 cranes actually, and they took the mikvah out and put it in the park, and they could build a building. So this is a man who thinks out of the box, and that's his great advantage. Maybe that he didn't go to and get a degree, and everybody talks to him and consults with him about everything, for even how they used to make olive oil. Everybody thinks olive, and he thinks bet, and this probably means that he's right. So the first thing is he went and he bought this gigantic crane, and had to chop it into 2 and bring it to the Golan Heights in Tel Aviv from this old factory. And then he went on top of the crane, and using a special kind of camera or film, he took a 3D infrared picture, and you can see I turned it facing north, although this is on Yeshu's website, which is called Restoration of Ancient Technology. That's his company. And the computer program that he used tells him where the walls were. Now, the truth is, some of these walls, you and me, we could figure it out together, but some of them we couldn't. And this is directly facing north, which also is pretty amazing. How they know where north was, exact north. This is facing Jerusalem, and it's the only public building there. So it's pretty sure that it's going to be a synagogue. It's very fascinating. This they already figured out in the 1880s. So the first thing is he took a picture from above. The second thing, here's the crane. Okay, this gigantic crane. He made a railroad track on each side so the crane could go back and forth. And they attached this chain coming down from the middle to a bathtub, and they could move the bathtub with these giant rocks that weighed tons in this huge bathtub supported by 4 chains, and you could move it back and forth. So the first thing was, we're going to make sure we know where all the rocks are, and then we're going to take them out, we're going to dig, and then we're going to bring back the rocks. But the computer will tell them where to put the stones. And Yeshu was a very humble man, would always say, whenever I'd bring a group there, he'd always stop his work and come and talk to the groups. It's incredible. In the middle of work, even though I wouldn't always ask him, he would say, you know what I'm proud of? I'm proud of that I didn't make any decision where the stones would go. The computer told me where to go. So how did the computer know? First of all, they marked every single rock, and there were over 1,500 rocks, some of them weighing tons, with a number, and then they put inside a microchip, because basalt has little holes in it, because it's volcanic, and you can see the size of the microchip. And that way, even before they took the rocks out, they had them numbered. When they took the rocks out, they put them in different places so that when they brought them back to build it, they would scan it. Just like Yeshu would sit with his laptop on top of the wall that he'd built, and the crane, he'd bring the crane towards him, and he'd scan, just like they do when you're at the checkout line. And he'd scan the rock, and the computer tells him where to put it. It was incredible. Now, if you look carefully here, take a look on the right-hand side. They've already taken the stones out of you can see the floor of the synagogue here. They just started. But here you can see that on the right-hand side, this is obviously the wall that's still standing. Maybe there's 2 courses or 3 courses of lines of rocks here. But here you can see how it was a slow earthquake that toppled it over, because you can see this line of rocks is the next course, and this line is the next course. So if we all got together and went there, we could probably get maybe 40% of the rocks back to where they really were, just by logic. But there's other places that they didn't fall down so nicely, like over here, and that's where the computer program comes in. When they took all the rocks out, they went down and took apart the floor, which is what you always do, because in almost every ancient synagogue, there's a more ancient one underneath. And it's the way of Jewish villages that as soon as you have enough people and resources and money to build a synagogue, you build it, and then the community grows, and you have to make it bigger. And therefore, when they went down underneath, they saw this, the floor of the original synagogue, which was about 100 years before, like around the 4th century, not far from when Oliphant and Schumacher thought it was from. It's pretty good to say 2nd, 3rd century, and it was 4th. But the actual synagogue that we will see is from the 5th century, and underneath is from the 4th century, and they understand that the community simply grew. Now you can tell because they didn't have trees in the Golan or in Israel in general. They used these gigantic slabs of rock, huge slabs of basalt, that if you know how to hew them out, you can get this. And on top of that, they put the floor. And underneath here, they found thousands of coins. That's a different story, but we'll leave that for now. And then they found these incredibly beautiful pillars, 2 of them specifically. Here you can see that the motif is grapes, and there's a good chance that that's because they grew grapes here. You know the story of the Golan Heights winery, one of the more successful wineries in Israel, that they brought in, after they came up with the idea of wine, they wanted to bring in experts, so they brought the experts in from UC Davis, yay, California. And they brought in the folks who said, you know what, you should grow grapes here. The Golan is going to be great for grapes. And then, this is in the 70s, in the early 70s. In the mid 70s, they started digging and they found all these wine presses. And they realized if we had dug earlier, we wouldn't have to, I mean, it's kind of cool that science and archaeology and, you know, farmers and Jewish thought that just all came together here. And we're in wine country. So this could be a fact, reflecting the fact that these were grape farmers nearby. And this is another pillar that they found that has, you can see a menorah, a lulav, an etrog, a shofar, and this thing, which nobody can figure out what it is apparently an incense shovel. Mm-hmm. Let's take a closer look. Let's take a look again. This is a different one. You can see this is not a Hanukkah menorah, which would have 8 + 1. This is a temple menorah, which would have 6 + 1. So if we were looking at this without the shovel, we'd say, okay, it's a Jewish symbol. Lulav and an etrog, a Jewish symbol. An incense shovel is a Jewish symbol? Anybody have an incense shovel symbol in their synagogue? No. Anybody have an incense shovel? I doubt it. Maybe you have an incense burner, but a shovel? That's from the temple. We use every day, and we burnt incense. It was part of the being in the temple. So people understand. People who are trying to understand the archaeology are saying the people who build the synagogue were connecting this building of the synagogue with the temple, something that's very hard to do today. For most people, we're not, Jewish people in general around the world are not connected to the idea of the temple. They're, you know, if you ask what are the 10 most important things we need to do in the Jewish world today, you're not going to find in the top 10 for a lot of people out there to build the temple. It's just not part of most people's day. It's true that it's in the prayers, and some people are totally connected to the temple. But in general, it's not something that we've lost it. But this today, it's also a political thing, and how would we build it, et cetera, et cetera. But back then, we're not talking about politics. We're talking about, we're seeing, according to this idea, if it's right, this incense shovel and everything else is telling us these people were missing their temple. And the best they could do, because they weren't in charge of their country, because they weren't able to do it for 1,001 reasons, this is their little temple. Our synagogue is our little temple. And just to remind everybody, the idea of the temple was, this is a place where everybody in the world, everybody has their own place, but anybody in the world can come to the temple and pray. It was a place where you left politics behind, and everything was like, we're one spiritual group praying to God. That was one of the ideas of the temple. There are many ideas. Anyway, it's a disconnect that many people have today, and the motifs that we see here kind of reconnect us to that idea. Hey, look what they found along the pile of rocks. A vulture. Remember the other one? This is the twin of the other vulture that they found and they put in Katrine. So once they found this on the floor, they went back, that's Yeshua on the left, and 3 Druze workers, because they're experts in working with basalt. And they schlepped it from the, it's pretty heavy. They schlepped it from the museum onto a truck. They made sure it didn't fall, and they brought it back, and they started to put together what turned out to be the bima. Look at this. They found in situ, okay, just covered by a pile of rocks, this staircase with handrails on the side made out of stone with a gigantic bima. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Those of
We were there when it was complete.
you were there. This is a drawing that before they put it together, Yeshua already understood what they're going to find, because we find in a lot of mosaic floors.
Right.
And what we have are 2 pillars on each side and an arch above the ark, which was made out of wood and didn't last, and a triangle up on top, okay? And steps that go up. Now, when he showed me this picture, I remember asking him, Yeshu, there's something I don't understand. This pillar and this pillar are totally different. There's no symmetry here. And he said to me, do you come from a family of Germans? I said, yeah, my mom, my grandparents. He said, of course, you're a Yeki. That's how you think. So the Romans liked symmetry. But the Byzantine period, which is after, right, when the Roman Empire went from being pagan to being Christian, and a whole different kind of art and architecture came, symmetry was not considered beautiful. Okay, so you have to stop thinking like a Yeki, like a German person, and think out of your box. Get out of your box, because that wasn't considered pretty back then. Here it is, almost rebuilt without the triangle on top, and you can see they had to fake a few of these rocks, very few. It's almost all the real thing, and it's incredibly beautiful. There's 2 pillars on both sides, which is weird. Why do you need 2 pillars? Look at this coin from the Bar Kokhba revolt when they wanted to get back to Jerusalem. This is a picture of the temple. The temple had 2 pillars on each side. It's amazing. Now, we understand from a lot of the sources that there was 1 pillar on each side. One was called Yachin, one was called Boaz. They even have names. But when they wanted to go back to the temple during this revolt, and they weren't successful, this is what they drew on their coin. They drew, or they engraved, 2 pillars on each side. And then we started to understand, it was the first time anybody built back a bima. This is in Kfar Nahum, actually mainly a Christian site today, but there was an ancient synagogue there. And here we have a triangle with an arch and 2 pillars on each side, which aren't really pillars, they're just embossed on it. And this was where the Torah was kept. They moved it in the synagogue. We started to understand that the 2 pillar thing was a thing. And here it is, rebuilt, picture at night, very beautiful, just like, wow, that's a bima. But made out of stone. You know, how many of your synagogues are the synagogues you don't go to? As we used to say, I don't go to that synagogue. So in the synagogue you don't go to, is your art complex made out of stone? I'm guessing it's made out of wood. Wood's kind of pretty cool, and you can play with it. But stone, why would you want to do that? It's heavy, it could fall, it's expensive. So this was a very expensive synagogue. How did these guys out in the sticks afford to build this thing? So first of all, this is the looking towards the north, right? The synagogue faces, the synagogue faces south. I said earlier it faced north. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. The synagogue faces north, faces south towards Jerusalem. Thank you. Now we're looking north at the entrance. So everybody will be facing us. And of course, the big joke is that you'll always say when you go into these ancient synagogues, you can't go in late because you're walking in the entrance. Everybody's facing you towards Jerusalem. You come in late, you're like, hi, I wanted to come early, but the alarm didn't go off, and I had, the kids, I had to take them. You have to make excuse. You have to be on time. This is an entrance that makes you be on time. But look where they put the entrance. It's not in the middle. Now, as someone who comes from people from Germany, I would want the entrance to be in the middle for it to be symmetrical. Why isn't it in the middle? It took an Israeli archaeologist in the 1980s to say this is something that happens in the Golan. In the Golan, the synagogues don't have an entrance in the middle because they wanted to have a huge, beautiful bima with an art complex. And you can't have it unless you put the entrance a little to the side and have a big wall here to put the bima. Now, let's go back to those German architects in 1905. Here they are in Kfar Nahum in the monumental synagogue. You can obviously see that they're not from the Middle East because they're not dressing the way one should, but you know, that's the way Germans are. Yeki, I think, comes from the word for vest, right? And here they are wearing their vests. And this is what the entrance that they saw in 1905. They took this picture. You can see it's just a pile of stones, and you can see it's an earthquake from these cracks, but you can just, it's like Lego, just put it back together. And they drew, in 1905, Kohn Watzinger, the expert German precise engineers, drew the following plan. Look where they put the entrance, folks. Where they put the entrance?
In the middle.
In the middle. They, which Yeshu showed me this and laughed at me, and of course all of us were laughing at each other, at ourselves. They had to force the plan to fit their idea of symmetry. They didn't do it right because it's not in the middle. Now, of course, it's very easy for us to say that now, but back then, obviously, we have to give them credit for even finding the place. But it is kind of funny.
Why would they make the entrance from the south, entering into the main vantage point of the Mitpalalim? From the back?
I do not know, but it's a phenomenon in Golan synagogues. It's a phenomenon. I don't think we really know. You know, we joke that it makes people come on time, but that's obviously not the reason. And there were certain things that you just did. Now, there are secondary entrances. You can see the secondary entrance on the left. There's actually also a secondary entrance from the right that was made later, but we don't know. We don't know.
Maybe it's because when you finish davening, you are walking towards the Beit HaMikdash. You exit. The exit should be in the direction.
Could be. Yafeh.
Rather than the entrance.
These are things that hopefully we'll find as we rebuild more of these synagogues, because the amount of things that people learned from the rebuilding of the synagogue was incredible. I mean, this is just one of them. That this isn't really the plan. But I'm not laughing at those guys. I'm amazed that in 1905 they did what they did. But it is something to think about, and that's a big question that you asked. And at the moment, there isn't an answer except that that's what they did specifically in the Golan.
Could it have something to do with the weather?
It could have something to do with the sun,
Yeah.
the weather, maybe, except that the windows were not in that direction. I don't know. That's a big question. I never really thought about that, but that's something to think about. I'll ask around and get back to you on that. Anyway, one of the big surprises was that there was a round window, okay? And they put this together. You can see Yeshua on the left and the Jews worker on the right, and they're putting in the keystone of this beautiful round window, which is just like Lego. Really, it's beautiful. And on the keystone is what's supposed to be a lion pouncing, and it looks more like a cat, but I couldn't do better than that, so I can't complain.
A lion is a cat.
What?
A lion is a cat.
A lion is a cat, yes. I stand corrected. I also don't have a cat in the home, so I'm not one of the cat lovers, so I can't speak for the cats, but they are relatives, yes, that I know. And of course, synagogues often have lions. Why was it pouncing? That's another question. What?
Is that really pagan?
I have not, no. If it was a lion eating another animal, that would be classically pagan. But just a lion who's pouncing, actually it's very common in synagogues. The two most common animals in synagogues, especially in the Golan, but also all over Israel, vultures, lions. And why, that's a fascinating story, but not here. So here, we're looking at 3 different windows. Now we're looking actually at the secondary entrance, which goes out towards the Kinneret, towards the west, and we're looking east. And we can see here on the left is a rectangular window that had bars, by the way. Here we have an arched window. This is called a pressure arch in order to take the pressure off of the lintel stone here. And here we have the round window. And here, of course, for those who remember, this is explains to us a midrash that was written over 1,000 years ago. And it goes like this. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And Jonah entered the mouth as a person who enters a large synagogue. And the 2 eyes of the fish were as open windows that brought light to Jonah. Now, what's amazing about that midrash? Nobody really understood it until they rebuilt the synagogue. So the synagogue explained the midrash. Usually what happens, we find something out in the field, and the midrash explains to us what we're seeing. But here, the opposite thing happened. We had this text. Nobody really understood exactly what they're talking about. But here we see a large synagogue and a round window, which is a big pain to build. And this is apparently what they were talking about, maybe, in the midrash, that this is how Jonah saw out of the 2 round eyes of the fish. I mean, it's pretty cool that they brought back this midrash out of the dead, as it were, after they found that there was a round window. Pretty cool. The people who actually wrote about it are a couple, an archaeologist, a husband and wife archaeologist, who wrote this book, Ancient Synagogues of the Golan. They're the ones that actually did excellent work on every one of the Golan synagogues and the things around them, and they came up with that midrash. Here's a beautiful picture from above. As they're building it, you can see the pillars, and you can see the area. It's there was a city here once, and hopefully once they dig it up, we'll know the name. So the first name that we have from the Arab guide of Oliphant was El Kanatir, the place of the arches. Later, the first man in the government to give a lot of money for the rebuilding of this synagogue, because you had to believe in Yeshu and the other archaeologists, Chaim ben David, in order to give the money. Nobody wanted to give the money in the beginning, but the minister of tourism, whose name was Rechavam Ze'evi, he was the first man to give money as minister of tourism to rebuild this synagogue, because he believed in it. He was also a big fan of archaeology. And a couple weeks after he gave the money, he was assassinated in Jerusalem. And they decided that they would name the synagogue in his name. And the temporary name was the Arches of Rechavam, which in Hebrew is Kshatot Rechavam, which I challenge you to say very quickly 3 times. Kshatot Rechavam. Who can say Kshatot Rechavam? Who can even remember that? That's much too complicated. And in the end, they came up with the idea of just calling it En Kshatot, the spring of the arches, which has a little bit of both. But the truth is, we don't know the name, and hopefully one day, maybe, we will. There's not even a guess today. This is an artist's rendition along with archaeologists on how the synagogue used to look. Here's the round window that we talked about, and this was the grand entrance. It may, I mean, now that I think about it, and what Judith said, maybe because of the shade, it could have to do with the sun that the entrance was from here. I don't know. I'm going to have to ask around. Here are the arches that we saw. We saw drawn by Gottlieb Schumacher in 1886. We saw a picture taken by Cohen Watzinger in 1905. And here, there's no tree. They rebuilt, after the thing fell down, they rebuilt the 2 arches. And they found a 3rd arch that nobody ever saw before because it was covered by brush. Here's a 3rd arch, which they didn't even try to rebuild, but below it are pools. And they brought in the experts and archaeologists and scientists from Hebrew U. What were these pools? And they came up with all kinds of ideas. In the end, guess who figured out what is accepted today as what these pools did?
Yeshu.
Yeshu, of course, there he is. A great picture. He's a very funny guy. He's very humble. He has a great sense of humor. He's amazing. And he came up with the idea that these pools were for whitening and soaking flax, which made the fanciest clothes in the ancient world 16 and 1700 years ago. This is a picture I've been here. I travel a lot with Irish folks. And when I brought them here to this synagogue, because they love seeing synagogues, and of course are tickled that Lawrence Oliphant is the one who discovered it, because he's from their area. And they all said, oh, flax. When we were kids, our parents and grandparents made us work in the flax pools and it stunk. It was terrible. We hated it. So flax makes these fancy linen clothes, which they still make today in Ireland. And in order to take the plant and make it into clothes, one of the first things you have to do is you have to soak it. And it smells really, really bad. And actually, there's a source in the Talmud that says the following. One should not use a mikveh with bad water, nor with flax soaking water, until the person adds to it more water, enough to prevent the water from smelling bad. So it's a thing that flax smells really, really bad. And that's
Put the downwind of the synagogue so that people wouldn't smell it.
so that's another thing, and that is that there's a number of sources in the Mishnah about not praying when there's a really bad smell. But here, of course, I have to share, I'm guessing that I shared the story with you when you were here. So I live in a village where there are more cows than there are people. And our synagogue is right in the middle of the moshav. And when we have a lot of guests, because there's a lot of B&Bs, and people come, and they come on Shabbat, nice clothes, and after the service is over, they come up to us. They always say, "How can you pray here? It smells terrible. I mean, are you even allowed to pray here?" And everybody in the moshav says, "What's wrong? We don't smell anything bad." So it's embarrassing sometimes, but I mean, it's funny because if you have visitors, you're right. But once you live and you can get used to anything, and you can get used to the smell of manure. You can get used to the smell of flax. But the truth is, there's a wind at Kanatir that always comes from the Kinneret. And actually, when I think about it, you're absolutely right that the windows are on the Kinneret side of the building. I think Judith, that you should team up with Yeshu. I think there's a future here. You're coming up with some great ideas.
Well, it's a great, when we make Aliyah, I have a new profession.
Yes. You'll explain to us all these ancient buildings. But so this is a fascinating subject, the whole idea of flax. This is the prime minister. I'm not going to talk about politics today, but I do have to read to you one other thing, which is kind of famous. Rabbi Yochanan said, and this is a humorous thing, if one is left money, an inheritance by parents, and you want to waste it, like what kind of a question is that? If I get an inheritance from my parents, I don't want to waste it. I'm going to try to save it. But let's say you wanted to waste it. How do you waste money? So Rabbi Yochanan is saying, it seems like it's like half of a joke, but he's also trying to say, perhaps you shouldn't do these things if you're going to waste money, is one, wear flaxen clothing. Two, use glass utensils. And three, hire workers, but don't stay with them during their work. So,
last one is.
I mean, this guy obviously knows what's going on in the world, and he's trying to say, guys, if you want to save your money, but he says it in kind of a humorous way. If you want to waste your parents' inheritance, so don't do these things. Don't use glass. Use plastic. They didn't have plastic, right? That just be very careful and don't wear flaxen clothing. So Rashi says, flaxen clothing is very expensive and it wears out quickly. So the importance of the flax is not just to say that it's flax, but Yeshu says this answers the question that I had after every stone that I put there. How did these guys afford this incredibly huge synagogue? Bigger than the one at Gamla, more beautiful than most of the synagogues they found. How did they afford it? They were in the shmata business, and they made the most expensive clothing in the world. And it's very, very similar to the story of Tzfat 500 years ago, where they have all the possibility of the Kabbalists and all the yeshivas and the people writing poetry and writing halakha and writing books. They made their money from making the most expensive clothes in the world and selling them to all over Europe. And this, of course, we can't prove it, but it just puts together pieces of a puzzle in a way that seems very fascinating. The flax pools paid for the synagogue. And I just want to add, before we finish with modern day stuff here, and that is my neighbor, the archaeologist, did his master's degree on how did they build ancient synagogues in ancient times. And he came up with some astronomical figure of $1,800,000. If you take together, in modern times, it would take millions of dollars to build an ancient synagogue. And how long would it take? He comes up with the figure, 80 years. He says in his work that from the time they decide to build a synagogue until the time that they actually make it and pray in it, 80 years. Now, if he's right, it's a theory, but if he's right, that means, today I'm guessing that when you start a building fund, you want to get it done in 2 or 3 years. Come on, I'm giving this money. I want to pray in that synagogue.
It's
Not
like
so in the ancient world.
It's like planting a tree for your grandchildren.
It's planting a tree for your grandchildren, exactly. In other words, I'm starting a project. I'm not going to enjoy it, and probably my kids aren't either. Maybe my grandchildren will, if things go fine and there's no corona and there's no fall of the stock market. But it's a fascinating idea that a synagogue has to be planned generations beforehand. So when they finally decided to open up about 1.5 years ago, the prime minister came, and beautiful gathering at night. And today you can have a bat mitzvah there. Here you can see the bat mitzvah girl, obviously the only girl of all the children. And this is how they're celebrating her bat mitzvah. And you can simply rent out the place. A bar mitzvah, Sephardic family, obviously, according to the Torah. And they're not a religious family. The folks are together, but they're like, welcome, come on in, do your thing, rent it. And of course, isn't that cute? A wedding. And I think it's really fascinating that, when you go and you go to an ancient synagogue and say, this is cool, now I understand this and that, that's one thing. When you go to an ancient synagogue and you use it, it's incredible. I mean, I can't even, there's no words to describe the connections that are happening there when you're using the ancient synagogue like they did back then. I think it's very powerful. This is an artist rendition.
When some of the words are the same words in the tefillot that were said then.
Yes. So I think, obviously, 2 out of the 3 families, the pictures that are taken here, and most of the people who rent it out are not religious people that will be considered part of the classic religious establishment. They're making a connection. They know the words. They're making their own connection. They choose it not because it's, they're fans of archaeology. I think they're using it for that same reason. They're saying the same words that a bride and groom would exchange. They're using the same words and the same words of prayer that were used thousands of years ago. And one day, hopefully, we'll be able to rebuild houses, maybe a few of them. This is, of course, a huge project, which means a lot to the entire world, not just synagogues, ancient buildings in general. It wasn't easy to get the insurance, but they got it. And they didn't put the second story on yet, and maybe they never will, maybe for that reason, so that if something would happen, it wouldn't come crashing down, but just the pillars, and you'd have to get out of there quick enough. But so far so good in the past few years. And this is a beautiful overview from a drone, of course. We're looking now towards Syria, towards the east. That's the border with Syria, this Tel Fares, this volcano. This is a village called Natur, and this is the synagogue. And down below, we can't even actually see the arches here. They're here in the corner. And I want to finish, although they've heard this before, because I'm sure I shared it with you, but I went with a very special man who lives in my moshav, who came to this ancient synagogue, and he told me something after which I looked at Kanatir in a totally different light, and I just wanted to share this with you and finish here. He said, when I look at these pile of stones, and I see people from outside of Israel came and discovered this synagogue, and they drew it, and they marveled at it, and that's great. Nobody really ever thought of rebuilding it. The Jewish way is to look at a pile of rocks and say, I'm going to rebuild it. That's the Jewish people. We were a pile of rocks after the destruction of the temple. Our people were a pile of rocks after the Shoah. Hebrew was a dead language. The whole country was a pile of rocks. What we did here, we, the greater we, in the past 2,000 years, in Israel, outside of Israel, is to look at a pile of rocks as an opportunity, as a challenge to rebuild. What the Jewish people have done with the Jewish people and the state of Israel and the land of Israel is to say, we're going to have the chutzpah to say, I'm not leaving this place as a pile of rocks to draw. I'm going to rebuild it and I'm going to use it. And that, the spirit, is the same spirit that brought people here to be farmers in the 1880s, that brought people to hang on outside of Israel for thousands of years, that brought people to start the state of Israel, and that brought people like Yeshu and Chaim ben David to say, you know what? It fell down in an earthquake, we can build it back. And once I heard that, I thought, wow, this is actually a simile for everything that is Jewish and Zionist and Israeli. It all comes together. And now to go there in this light puts it into a bigger framework. So next time, feel free to come, use it, take pictures, to stand in awe, and I'll be happy to go there with you.
Good story about life too, that sometimes could be apparently a pile of rocks. And what
Yes,
we can
and
do with life, what we can do with life when it breaks down.
and certainly I think today, right, with this going on, we can look at Corona as really a pile of rocks, and you know, just be depressed. But the truth is, it's not the cards you're dealt. It's what you do with the cards that you're dealt. So anyway, thank you for your ears. And
Thank you.